This is Nagorno-Karabakh, a landlocked region in the South Caucasus within the mountainous range of Karabakh in the Middle East. This fairly small region, measuring 1,700 square miles, has over the past decades been the cause of tens of thousands of brutal deaths and geopolitical conflicts so intense, the world powers like the US and Russia have been scratching their heads on how to resolve it. Now, the same small region is yet again the site of more armed conflict, but this time it threatens to drag not just the US, but the entire world into another brutal war.
The chaotic and rapid collapse of the Soviet Union more than 30 years ago left some unresolved and complex political disputes.
Resulting six-year war killed over 20,000 people and displaced hundreds of thousands.
It's a conflict that you may not know much about, yet it's been happening on and off for decades. Armenia and Azerbaijan, two former Soviet territories, have been locked in conflict for 32 years over a piece of disputed territory.
The unhealed scars between Armenia and Azerbaijan have erupted into a modern-day inferno of trench warfare.
Well, this is a direct result of the devastating 44-day war. And in this post-war environment, we see a sudden flurry of diplomatic engagement and activity.
The two former Soviet republics have been locked in conflict over the area for decades.
Tensions continue to rise between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
This area, Nagorno-Karabakh, is a disputed territory, hence the fighting and bloodshed. On one hand, it is internationally recognized as part of Azerbaijan. Looking at this map here, you can see why. It is a territory literally within the nation of Azerbaijan. On the other hand, however, most of the ethnic population there, around 95%, is Armenian, and so Armenia, geologically located right here, claims influence over the area as it says its people can't be governed by another nation but them. In fact, the residents of Nagorno-Karabakh have claimed to be their own independent state, called the Republic of Artsakh, something not recognized by anyone but Armenia. This dispute is what lies central to these disagreements and has resulted in not one, but two full-blown wars and a ton of deadly skirmishes that continue to date. In today's video, we will be exploring the roots of this conflict, how it's impacting global politics, and just why it's threatening to drag not just the US, but Russia as well into what might be a third world war. Before we talk about that war, help us with ours. Videos like the one that talks about the not-so-rosy side of world politics tend to not be favored by both the bots and the you-know-who algorithm. That's why your likes are crucial in fighting that war of validation and information. Please press the like button and think of that as a headshot against the enemy. We appreciate you. Now back to the basics. As with all things to understand the modern problems that we currently have, we need to start with the roots of the problem and how it all started. This region has long since been an area of contention in the world. For centuries going back, Muslim Arab Bahanas and Christian Armenians, both of whom call the region home, clashed over who should control it. Given that the area lies right in the middle of the two nations, it makes sense why both nations claimed it in centuries past. Things started taking a more organized shift once Russia got involved, which it did in 1823 when it took over the land. The region developed quietly through the decades of Soviet rule, but the ethnic tensions remained and fostered in the region. When the Russian Empire dissolved in 1918, tensions between newly independent Armenia and Azerbaijan were reignited. Barely 3 years later, communist-controlled Russia set its sights on the independent states of the Caucasus region and began incorporating them into what would become the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or more commonly, the USSR. When the fate of the region was first weighed by this new power, it was concluded that Karabakh would be part of the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic. This was a strategic decision by the Soviet Union designed to garner support from Armenia for their cause, and for a while, it worked. Had nothing changed, this would have been the fate of the region and Armenia would have possession of it. However, as with anything Russian, the unpredictability of its leaders was to come into play. Whether it was for the better or worse is something that history will have to judge decades from now. What we do know for a fact is that Joseph Stalin, Russia's great leader and the then new Commissar of Nationalities, reversed the decision just 3 years later. What then became the fate of Nagorno-Karabakh was that it would function as an autonomous administrative region of Azerbaijan. So technically, Russia just took the neutral point, giving the region autonomy, and not flat out handing it to either Armenia or Azerbaijan. Of course, this did not come uncontested. For years, the 95% Armenian population majority in the autonomous region complained that Azerbaijan restricted their autonomy and discriminated heavily against them. However, this fell on deaf ears as the Soviet Union did little to address these measures, possibly as a way of trying to avoid conflict again. Again, had the Soviet Union maintained power, this wouldn't have been a problem. But well, as we all know, the Soviet Union itself eventually crumbled. When it did in the late 1980s, the long dissatisfied ethnic Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh petitioned to become part of the Republic of Armenia. They did so in a referendum that the Azerbaijanis refused to participate in, with their government then coming around to try and crush the separatist movement in 1988. This action resulted in the first intense violent clashes in the region. With the Soviet Union dealing with a lot of in-house matters, there wasn't a buffer to stop war from happening. When the Soviet Union then collapsed in 1991, both Azerbaijan and Armenia declared independence from the USSR, and the regional clashes in Nagorno-Karabakh flared into full-out war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The chaos was now full-scale. Let's put some graphics to this again. We want you to keep up. When the war raged on, it emanated from two different perspectives. Those are how Armenia saw the border and how Azerbaijan saw the border. So far, as Armenia is concerned, the region should look something like this. During that period in the early 1990s, the Karabakh Armenian forces, supported by Armenia, gained control of much of southwestern Azerbaijan, including Nagorno-Karabakh and the territory connecting the enclave with Armenia. That enlarged the area that they technically wanted, and hence their view of what was theirs changed. On the other end of the spectrum, Azerbaijan sees the region more like this. Their logic is simple. If a region is in their territory, then well, it's theirs regardless of who lives there. With no resolution in sight, brutal war ensued. The war was brutal, with over 30,000 people killed, a lot of them civilians. In addition to the casualties, more than 1 million people became refugees, with the region heavily destabilized. Atrocities were also committed heavily, with both sides engaging in ethnic cleansing during the Nagorno-Karabakh War. The Azerbaijanis committed atrocities against ethnic Armenians and Armenian forces against ethnic Azeris. Despite the brutal humanitarian toll, negotiations between the sides repeatedly broke down. Eventually, in 1994, the newly independent nations of Armenia and Azerbaijan signed the Bishkek Protocol, a ceasefire brokered by Russia. For the most part, Armenia had come out victorious in the First War, and the ceasefire that was negotiated left Nagorno-Karabakh as an autonomous region in Azerbaijan. Not only did Armenia end up controlling Nagorno-Karabakh, but it also occupied 20% of the surrounding Azerbaijani territory, which was a blow to the original landowners. Despite a ceasefire being negotiated, a peace treaty could not be agreed on. Since then, Armenian and Azerbaijani troops have been divided by a contested line of contact laid out in the Bishkek Protocol. It has become increasingly militarized over the years and has been called one of the world's 3 most militarized borders. That just shows how explosive this conflict is. Before we continue on with the border conflict between these two areas, in between the first war that Azerbaijan lost and the second one that came, something had happened to Azerbaijan. Very similar to the Chinese and Taiwan miracles, Azerbaijan had its own miracle, its own economic boom. What fueled Azerbaijan's miracle? Liquid gold, or better known as oil. Over the last 2 decades, oil has been the defining factor for Azerbaijan, not only for its economic growth, but also for its development. During the first 10 years of the millennium, Azerbaijan experienced an explosion in wealth as oil GDP, comprising half of the sectoral share of the economy, grew by an average of 21% per year, fueled by the global upsurge of oil prices and increased production. Since the time of Azerbaijan's independence, its oil revenues have increased, and their use has come under the management of the Azerbaijan state. To its credit, Azerbaijan has undertaken significant initiatives towards suitable management of its oil. The first such initiative was to sign the well-known Contract of the Century, a bundle of numerous production-sharing agreements in 1994 with 11 major oil companies for the Azeri Shirag Gunsheli oil fields. This led to some $60 billion of foreign direct investment and sharp increases in Azerbaijan's oil production since 1997. As these major oil companies created the infrastructure for the movement and transportation of oil, the country undoubtedly benefited. On one hand, they could now transport more oil to the global market, and secondly, they now had access to more global markets. On the back of the Contract of the Century and other initiatives that the government continued to pursue, Azerbaijan grew rich. It went from this, a poor struggling nation, to this, an economic powerhouse. Within a few years, the nation's total GDP grew more than tenfold, from $6 billion to $66 billion. This was accompanied by a rapid decline in poverty from 49.6% to 7.6%. On top of that, the country recorded an increase in real wages and middle-class growth. So fairy tale was the country's boom, that for over a decade, it was the fastest growing economy in the world. Between 2000 and 2010, the economy grew on average by more than 15% annually. This boom that Azerbaijan experienced set it apart from Armenia. Not only did Azerbaijan become richer, with more development, a better lifestyle, and higher population growth, but it could also channel more money into the military as well. As of 2023, Azerbaijan spends over $3.1 billion on its defense and military. Their neighbor and rival, Armenia, even after increasing their budget by almost 50%, still spends almost 3 times less at $1.2 billion. Though substantial, that is not a small difference at all. On top of all these advantages, Azerbaijan also developed relationships with powerful friends. Azerbaijan has good relations with many countries around the world, including Turkey, Russia, Israel, and most post-Soviet states. Additionally, Azerbaijan has strong ties with many countries in the European Union and the United States. Turkey's relationship with the state is of particular note because the two nations are extremely close. They even have a mutual defense treaty. Under the terms of the treaty, both Turkey and Azerbaijan will support each other using all possibilities in the case of a military attack or aggression against either of the countries. This is very important because, unless you forgot, Turkey is a key member of NATO. That speaks volumes. Another important relationship has been Israel. At present, Israel supplies almost 70% of Azerbaijan's weapons and in return receives about half of its imported oil. An article from this Israeli newspaper, Haaretz, reads, Israel has exported a very wide range of weapons to the country, Azerbaijan, starting with Taver assault rifles all the way to the most sophisticated systems such as radar, air defense, anti-tank missiles, ballistic missiles, ships, and a wide range of drones, both for intelligence and attacks purposes. Israeli companies have also supplied advanced spy tech such as communications monitoring systems from Verint and the Pegasus spyware from the NSO group. Tools that were used against journalists, the LGBT community, and human rights activists in Azerbaijan too. These are deep ties that are being shown here. Armenia, on the other hand, hasn't been quite as strategic with its relationships as its rival. Its main relationship is with Russia, with whom the two have a mutual defense agreement. However, given that Russia's hands have been a bit tied lately, it has not been the best of situations for Armenia. It has refused to activate that same clause before in 2020, when Armenia clung to it for help. With all this said, let's talk of what happened in 2020, when the second war between the two reared its head.
Armenia's defense ministry tweeted these videos on Sunday morning. It says they show Azeri tanks that have just been destroyed in the disputed region of Nagorno-Karabakh.
Homes are being shelled and civilians are bearing the brunt of this battle.
Azerbaijan said on Thursday that at least 2,783 of its soldiers were killed during its recent conflict with ethnic Armenian forces over the enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh.
Armenia has accused Azerbaijan of trying to advance into its territory after deadly fighting between the countries broke out overnight. Now,
as the international community pleaded with Armenia and Azerbaijan to stop fighting, they did the opposite. Now, in its 4th day, violence is increasing in the disputed region of Nagorno-Karabakh.
Since the First War ended, there have been periodic skirmishes all along the two nations' border, including the use of attack drones, heavy weaponry, and special operations on the front lines. In 2016, particularly fierce clashes between Azerbaijan and Armenian-backed forces in Nagorno-Karabakh raged for 4 days, with tensions getting high and diplomacy being acquired to end the bloodshed. These skirmishes, however, were nothing compared to what came in 2020. Just 26 years after the First War, the two powers locked heads once again over the Nagorno-Karabakh region. A full-scale war broke out after Azerbaijan launched an offensive across the line of contact held by Armenian forces and local fighters. The campaign, which began on the morning of September 27th, sparked a 6-week-long war with violence that could only be matched by the 1992 war. In this war, Azerbaijan was prepared. Remember when we covered their economic might a few minutes ago? Well, that came in handy. With advanced weaponry, more manpower, and more money to spend, the Azeris attacked deep past Armenian lines, making use of heavy modern weaponry. Also, remember when we spoke about allies? Well, Azerbaijan also shone in that department. A key feature of the war was the military support that Turkey, a regional power and longtime foe of Armenia, gave Azerbaijan. In the months before the conflict broke out, Turkey's military exports to Azerbaijan rose 6-fold, according to export data analyzed by Reuters. The sales included drones and other military equipment, which experts say helped turn the tide for Azerbaijan. The result of this 6-week war was over 7,000 combatants dead and the definitive loss of Armenia. Russia came in to mediate a ceasefire, and as part of the condition for that, Armenia had to give up the land that it had won and held for decades. The Nagorno-Karabakh region and the surrounding areas that Armenia had won in the First War were returned to Azerbaijan, but this was all done reluctantly. Russia had to send in about 2,000 troops as peacekeepers to maintain peace in that region, because the ceasefire was exactly that, a ceasefire. Peace was not guaranteed to last in the region. Russia, the main mediator and the governing power in the region, as we all know, decided to attack Ukraine. This means that since February 2022, Russia has been distracted, to say the least. With Ukraine proving to be more of a headache than originally expected, Russia has had a lot on its hands. At the same time, with the oil and gas restrictions that Europe and Russia have been having since the war started, Azerbaijan proved to be an alternative solution for Europe. In fact, last year, the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, paid a high-level visit to Azerbaijan, crowned with the signing of a new gas export deal between the EU and Baku. The parties agreed upon expanding the volume of gas exports from Azerbaijan to Europe from 2021's 8 billion cubic meters to around 20 billion cubic meters by 2027. They also agreed to work on boosting Azerbaijan's export potential in the renewable energy sector, including offshore wind and so-called green hydrogen. Speaking in Baku, von der Leyen emphasized the EU's long-term partnership with Azerbaijan and declared it a reliable partner, comparing it to an aggressive and untrustworthy Russia. These two factors, Russia being at war and Europe becoming increasingly dependent on Azerbaijan for oil and gas, made Azerbaijan feel invincible. The nation thought these two factors would provide the perfect distraction for them to solidify their hold over Nagorno-Karabakh, and well, they did. Last year around September, the Azerbaijan forces started ramping up attacks against Armenian forces. By the end of September last year, the Armenian government reported that Azerbaijan had killed 105 of its service members, and Azerbaijan reported that 71 members of its security forces had died. That was the largest death toll since the 2020 war. Since that time, several skirmishes have been occurring with Azerbaijan having the upper hand, but everything becoming increasingly tense. Now even the civilians are not safe. Recently, Azerbaijan intensified the pressure on the Armenian population of Karabakh itself, twice shutting off gas to population centers. Its forces have deployed Turkish Bayraktar drones, publicly calling on Armenian civilians to leave the region, and temporarily taking control of a small Armenian village, causing its residents to flee. These events, among more, we will talk about in the coming minutes, expose security gaps in the 2020 ceasefire, and heighten fears of renewed war and ethnic cleansing in that region. Speaking of cleansings, the Lachin Corridor, the only land route that gives Armenia direct access to Nagorno-Karabakh, has even been blockaded and checkpoints set up. Azerbaijan has claimed that it was being used to transport personnel, ammunition, and weapons, including landmines, something that Armenia has disputed but failed to get any meaningful change. What is now happening, though, is that the region of Nagorno-Karabakh has effectively been cut off, and this is the reality of living in that region now.
In Stepanakert, empty supermarket shelves are becoming increasingly common.
They want to eliminate people living here. The only road connecting us to the whole world is closed.
After Azerbaijan temporarily shut the Lachin Corridor in July, locals are struggling to get hold of even basic supplies.
Right now we have also water shortages, and because of the water shortages and electricity shortages and no gas, the bakeries don't work, so there is not enough bread even in the shops.
Reportedly, some 120,000 people are in urgent need of food, medicine, and other supplies.
Since the ceasefire, that single route, the Lachin Corridor, has been disrupted.
Hunger has run rampant as supplies are not able to reach the region. This has intensified as time has gone on because in the entirety of this year, Nagorno-Karabakh has been cut off. Even the international community has been unable to do much as large organizations like the Red Cross are unable to deliver humanitarian assistance to the region, and trucks with hundreds of tons of supplies are stranded on the roads. France, a staunch supporter of Armenia, has come out to speak against Azerbaijan. France, however, is an interesting case with clouded motivations. We'll cover that in a different video. The plight of the afflicted communities led Luis Moreno Ocampo, a former chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, have been calling this action by Azerbaijani criminals, and they have branded it as an act of genocide. Citing an article in the Genocide Convention that referred to the act as deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, Luis Moreno Ocampo has been trying to gather support to force the Azeri hand. He has said, "The idea of genocide is not just about killing, but about removing people from the land. There are no crematories and there are no machete attacks. Starvation is the invisible genocide weapon. Without immediate dramatic change, this group of Armenians will be destroyed in a few weeks. Look at this tweet that he made regarding the matter less than a month ago. In all honesty, the matter is dire, but no resolution seems to be in sight. Despite being brought up at an emergency session of the United Nations Security Council, no definitive resolution has been stated. Various officials have spoken up about the matter, however. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, called on Azerbaijan to restore free movement through the corridor. Armenian Foreign Minister Azarat Morzoyan said that deprivation imposed on the enclave was a form of warfare that would lead to the ethnic cleansing of the people of Nagorno-Karabakh. Even in Washington, a handful of U.S. lawmakers like Senator Alex Padilla have made public appeals to end the blockade and stop the violence. He said in a statement, Azerbaijan's systematic ethnic cleansing of the people of Nagorno-Karabakh through a large-scale and unprovoked invasion is unconscionable. Particularly egregious is their weaponization of the blockade to starve the people of Nagorno-Karabakh and block humanitarian assistance. Azerbaijan's UN envoy has disputed these charges and said that it's propaganda being touted by the loser. Azerbaijan maintains that Armenia wants to play the victim to mislead the international community. The Azerbaijan government has reiterated that the restrictions on movement along the Lachin corridor, which is supposed to be administered by Russian peacekeepers, are necessary to stop, among other things, the illicit supply of arms from Armenia into the enclave. They claim that by refusing to use alternative routes provided through Azerbaijan, they validated the accusations. Those are the two sides. Judge the merits of each as you will. To add to all of this, barely hours ago, it was reported that Azerbaijan seemed to be preparing for another round of provocations, just days after more deaths had taken place in skirmishes. Much like what Russia did before attacking Ukraine by building up troops at the border, Azerbaijan has copied the same playbook. With more troops, more equipment, more funding, and more allies, it seems that Azerbaijan has all the advantages in this. At the same time, Azerbaijan is accusing Armenia of the same military buildup. It's quite the headache. To prevent further bloodshed, diplomacy is key. The EU and Russia have tried to use various means to diffuse the tension, but Russia's invasion of Ukraine now complicates these efforts to manage the conflict jointly. In the past, Russian diplomacy has been what saved the day, but not anymore. After the brutalities and atrocities committed in Ukraine, Moscow now has a damaged reputation, while the populations of Armenia and Azerbaijan have signaled their discomfort with Russia's actions in Ukraine and are supportive of the Ukrainian people. It makes sense. We mean, you can't wear the hats of peacemaker and aggressor at the same time, now can you? We say all this to emphasize that things are at a critical moment. Consensus through diplomacy will be very hard to reach. But let's be positive for a second. If lasting peace is to be found in the region, what exactly needs to be resolved permanently? Well, the problems revolve around three main issues. Firstly, and obviously, we have the Nagorno-Karabakh region. The governments of Armenia and Azerbaijan have made repeated statements in recent months, saying that they recognize each other's territorial integrity, including with respect to Nagorno-Karabakh and adjacent districts, which are part of Azerbaijan under international law. If Armenia can get detailed guarantees to protect the rights of the ethnic Armenians in that region, and Azerbaijan gets official ceding of the areas surrounding the region, plus some sort of control in the region, that just might satisfy both parties. Secondly, there needs to be a resolution concerning the frontier. This refers to the border between the two countries, which runs for at least 600 miles. The challenge with this frontier is that it is not demarcated, and at points, troops are stationed within easy striking distance of each other. That is why it is so easy for various conflicts and skirmishes to occur, because the border is not quite a border. Both countries want this resolved. If the border issue can be rectified and properly demarcated, this will reduce conflict points and hence ultimately conflict in general. Lastly, the third thing that needs attention is transport routes. You see, this conflict has resulted in so many problems, transportation being one of them. Azerbaijan and Turkey have had their borders closed to Armenia for 3 decades now because of the conflict. There has been talk about reopening these borders and construction of transport routes throughout. If this matter can be resolved to the satisfaction of all parties, it would mark the last big matter that is stopping peace from being realized. Maybe, just maybe, if all these matters are taken care of, for the first time in several decades, peace might prevail. That's a big maybe. So where does all this leave us? Well, if a third war is to erupt, however, the results could be catastrophic. there are too many uncertainties to place. For starters, would Russia for the first time ever honor its military pact with Armenia and come to aid the nation? Would Iran and Israel be drawn in as close allies of each of the nations? If that happens, how would the US and NATO react? Would that push the global war to another front in Azerbaijan and Armenia? Could this be the trigger that sets off an all-out global war? So many questions and so few answers, though we're positive that some of these are answers we don't want to find out. Time will tell, but until then, we'll be on standby keeping you updated as the situation unravels.